He inherited an old painting, but what happened next will haunt him. Hey everyone! Welcome back to Will I Be Happy, where we dive into some of the spookiest stories, chilling mysteries, and unforgettable twists. I'm your narrator, and today we're exploring a haunting tale that mixes horror, unsettling neighbors, and a house with secrets you won't believe. Trust me, this one will keep you on edge from start to finish. If you're into suspense and some spine-tingling moments, you're in the right place. Before we jump into this gripping story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss out on more creepy tales. And drop a comment below. What would you do if your neighbor was acting a little too interested in your haunted house? Now let's get started. A cool October breeze swept through Columbus, Ohio, carrying the scent of dried leaves and faint whispers of a distant storm. Brian Luster stood in front of his late grandmother's Victorian home, now his. The house, weathered by time, loomed with its sagging roof and ivy-covered walls. But to Brian, it still felt like stepping into his childhood. The wind rustled through the ancient trees that lined the driveway, their skeletal branches casting eerie shadows on the ground, while the city buzzed faintly in the distance, a reminder that Halloween was just around the corner. At first glance, Brian seemed ordinary, maybe too ordinary. A man stuck in the grind of his late 30s, he was one of those people you might pass on the street without a second thought. A civil engineer by trade, he had a knack for solving problems and seeing things others couldn't. He was meticulous to a fault, always planning 2 steps ahead, as if trying to outwit the chaotic hand life had dealt him. But beneath the calm exterior simmered something more, a restlessness, a frustration, a man haunted by what could have been. Despite his professional success, his personal life felt like one long game of limbo, where nothing ever truly fell into place. The source of that restlessness wasn't hard to pinpoint. Brian had spent the last few years tangled in the suffocating grasp of fertility struggles with Anne, his wife. Every attempt to start a family had ended in disappointment, each doctor's visit feeling like another nail in the coffin of their dreams. Their once electric relationship now flickered like a dying bulb. The joy, the laughter, they had all but evaporated, leaving only the cold, silent weight of expectation. Moving into his grandmother's house wasn't just about inheritance. It was an escape, a desperate attempt to fill a void, though deep down, Brian knew the house might swallow them both whole before offering any peace. "I still can't believe we're living here," Anne said, her voice barely louder than the breeze. She hugged herself, her gaze lingering on the darkened windows. It feels like she's still inside, holding one of her Sunday dinners. Brian let out a half-hearted chuckle. "Yeah, I expect her to come out holding those old silver candlesticks, barking orders while balancing a turkey on a tray." He paused, an edge creeping into his voice. "Remember how she used to yell at us for not setting the table just right?" Anne nodded, forcing a smile, but her eyes betrayed the discomfort that ran deeper than her dislike for Maggie. Brian's grandmother had always unsettled her, a woman of rigid rules, sharp words, and a gaze that could freeze water. To Anne, Maggie had been nothing more than a dictator, ruling her house like a throne. But to Brian, she had been a force of nature, a woman who stepped in to raise him and his brother Alex after their parents died, and who held the family together with the iron grip of tradition. A woman he both feared and revered in equal measure. As Brian fumbled with the key, the door groaned open slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the house itself was unsure about welcoming them back. Inside, the smell of dust, old wood, and Maggie's signature rosewater perfume clung to the air like ghosts refusing to move on. For a moment, Brian froze. He could almost see her bustling around, candlesticks in hand, her sharp voice slicing through the thick atmosphere like a knife. "You boys never learn," she'd say with that sharp, almost predatory smile. "Dinner's ready." The door slammed shut behind him, jolting him from the past. He blinked, and the vision of his grandmother faded into the shadows. Inside, the living room was just as they had left it after the funeral. Sheets draped over the furniture like pale, forgotten corpses. Everything felt suspended, untouched, as though time itself had paused, waiting for some terrible secret to reveal itself. And in that moment, Brian knew something unsettling. This house wasn't his. Not yet. It still belonged to her. "I think we made a mistake moving here," Anne said suddenly, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. She stood near the fireplace, her arms crossed like a shield, the flicker of uncertainty turning into something darker. Brian sighed, running his hand through his hair as he placed the keys on the dusty kitchen counter. "We didn't have a lot of options, Anne. We couldn't afford a new place, and selling this place would take months. Besides, it's family." Anne turned to him, her face bathed in the ghostly glow of the streetlight seeping through the dirty curtains. "I know," she said softly, "but it's just, every time I walk through this house, I feel her. I feel her watching us, judging us." Brian clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. The frustration was bubbling to the surface, but it wasn't just about the house. It was everything. The years of trying to have children, the strain on their marriage, the silence that had settled between them like an unspoken curse. "She's gone, Anne. We're here now. We make this place ours." "Are we?" Anne's voice cracked, her vulnerability peeking through. "Brian, we've been stuck in this loop for years. Nothing changes, and now we're trapped in this mausoleum." Brian's eyes darkened, his silence heavy with the weight of a truth neither of them wanted to face. The tension hung in the air, thick and unyielding, like the cobwebs collecting in the corners of the room. Later that night, after unpacking a few boxes, Brian found himself climbing into the attic. His grandmother had always warned him never to go up there, said it was a place filled with memories better left undisturbed. But now it was just another room, another secret, and secrets were meant to be uncovered. Under a layer of dust and old fabric in a forgotten trunk, Brian found it, a large, haunting portrait. His stomach twisted the moment he pulled it out. The elderly man in the painting was gaunt, his thinning gray hair framing a face that looked like it had witnessed too many tragedies. But it wasn't just the man's hollow, sunken eyes that sent a chill down Brian's spine. It was the faint outline of silver candlesticks clutched in his bony hands. The very same candlesticks his grandmother had used for every holiday dinner, and beneath the man's feet, barely visible, was a turkey resting on a silver tray. Anne appeared behind him, her voice uneasy. "What is that?" "I don't know," Brian whispered, his voice barely audible, the unease creeping into his bones. But deep down, he knew. The man in the painting wasn't just any stranger. He knew exactly who Brian was. And in the shadows of the attic, Brian could almost hear his grandmother's voice, laced with an eerie finality. The chilly October air had nothing on the cold unease that had settled over Brian and Anne ever since moving into his late grandmother's house. But tonight, Brian was determined to shake off that heavy, haunted feeling. Downtown Columbus was dressed up for fall, pumpkins stacked outside every shop, orange and purple lights illuminating the street, and people walking around in casual costumes, though Halloween was still weeks away. Brian couldn't help but feel like the whole city was in on some joke he hadn't caught on to yet. "Can't believe we're actually out," Anne said, looking at the lit-up bar where they were meeting Alex and Janine. "Almost feels normal." Brian laughed, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Normal? Sure, if you count living with the ghost of my grandmother and her weird painting of Mr. Creepy McCandlesticks as normal." "Stop it," Anne shuddered. "I swear, every time I pass that thing, it feels like he's waiting for something. What kind of person hangs that up in their house?" "A person who thinks candlesticks are a personality trait," Brian muttered, holding the door open for her. The warm light and the buzz of conversation hit them as they entered O'Hara's, the cozy bar where they were meeting Alex and Janine. The contrast between the eerie house they'd just left and this place made Brian feel like he'd stepped into another world. "There they are!" Alex called out, waving a pint of beer in greeting. He and Janine were tucked into a booth at the back, already looking far too comfortable. "About time!" Janine chimed in with her signature smirk. "Thought you might have been kidnapped by a ghost or something." Brian snorted, sliding into the booth. Oh, no ghosts yet, just the usual. Haunted paintings, creepy shadows, and the occasional feeling that Grandma's still judging us for not polishing her candlesticks properly. Ah, yes, the candlesticks, Janine said, leaning in dramatically. I think I've heard more about those silver things than I have about your actual life. Was Maggie obsessed with them or something? Anne rolled her eyes. Obsessed isn't the word. She would stare at you while you polished them, making you feel like you were personally responsible for tarnishing them just by breathing. And God forbid you set them down wrong at dinner. Every Christmas felt like I was auditioning for Best Supporting Napkin folder. Brian chuckled. You think that's bad? Try growing up with her. I once got grounded for sneezing during one of her famous dinners. Sneezed. Just a sneeze. Alex raised an eyebrow, still amused. Come on, Maggie wasn't that bad. Sure, she had her quirks, like, making us polish things that were already shiny, but she cared. Oh, she cared all right, Janine cut in with a grin. Cared about making us all feel like underperforming butlers in our own homes. Speaking of Maggie, Anne said, leaning forward, we found this painting of some old guy in the attic, holding her beloved candlesticks and a turkey. A turkey of all things. The way he's staring, I swear, it feels like he's waiting for Thanksgiving so he can finally drop that bird. Wait, what? Alex laughed, nearly spitting out his beer. A turkey? Who paints a portrait of a guy holding dinner? Was he hungry when they did it? No idea, Brian replied, shaking his head. But it's like, every time you look at the painting, his eyes follow you around the room. Not like, oh, weird perspective. I mean, like, really follow you. It's creepy. Janine scrunched her nose in exaggerated disgust. I don't know what's worse, the fact that your grandma thought this guy was important enough to have a portrait done, or the fact that she wanted to immortalize him with a turkey. I mean, come on, was this her idea of art? Anne shrugged. You didn't know her like I did. She once told me that modern art was just people's poor attempts at making the mundane look important. I guess she thought candlesticks and turkeys were a real cultural statement. Brian couldn't help but laugh. Honestly, I feel like if we stare at it long enough, the old guy is going to start yelling at us about how we're not cutting the turkey properly. Alex raised his beer and grinned. To Grandmama, the queen of candlesticks and awkward family dinners. To Maggie, the others echoed, clinking glasses. But the laughter fizzled out as Brian spoke again, his voice quieter. Seriously, though, there's something weird about that painting. It doesn't belong in that attic. Or anywhere, really. Anne nodded. It's the eyes. They're hollow, like he's waiting for something. Every time I walk past it, I feel like he's watching, just waiting. Waiting for what? Janine asked, leaning in with a smirk. For someone to bring the stuffing? Or for us to join him, Brian muttered darkly, though he was only half joking. Janine waved him off. Please, if some old dead guy thinks he's gonna haunt you over candlesticks, I'd just offer to polish them for him. That's probably all he wants. Suddenly, the easygoing atmosphere of the bar was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. A high-pitched scream echoed from the front of the room, silencing every conversation in the bar. Heads turned toward the entrance. A woman, her face pale and frozen in terror, stood trembling near the door, her hand clutched at her chest as if trying to hold her heart inside. Ah! Brian's stomach dropped, and the room felt like it tilted just slightly. The warm, buzzing bar seemed to darken. The laughter and cheer sucked out of the air. What the hell? Alex whispered. No one moved. No one breathed. The warm glow of the bar's pumpkin-themed lights cast long shadows across the room, wrapping everything in a cozy October haze. But that all came to a sudden stop when a shrill scream cut through the noise. It's a cockroach! The woman's voice shot up an octave, eyes wide in terror. Brian sighed, already knowing exactly who it was. Melissa, their nosy, overly familiar new neighbor, stood near the entrance, her hand dramatically clutching her chest. The bartender trudged over with a broom, muttering, "Burnt chips," as he swept the crumbs from the floor. A few patrons snickered, but Melissa brushed it off like she'd just been part of the evening's entertainment. Oh, great. Brian muttered to Anne. "Here we go." Anne rolled her eyes. "It's like she has a radar for wherever we are." Melissa, undeterred by the stifled laughter, smoothed down her coat and strode over to their table with a big fake smile plastered across her face. She slid into the booth beside Alex, completely ignoring the fact she hadn't been invited. "Brian!" she exclaimed, her eyes practically devouring him. "What a delightful surprise! I was just thinking about you." She winked dramatically, leaning back in the booth. Brian forced a smile, feeling an unwelcome chill run down his spine. "Yeah, just trying to relax a little." "I saw you moving into Maggie's house last week," Melissa continued, her gaze lingering on him a little too long. "And can I just say, you were looking delicious in those boxers while taking out the trash. Gave me quite the view." She let out a giggle that was entirely too pleased with itself. Brian's face went red as he shot a quick, embarrassed glance at Anne. Melissa, meanwhile, looked like a cat who'd just spotted the world's biggest bowl of cream. Alex nearly spit out his beer, and Janine smirked, clearly enjoying the awkwardness. But Anne's expression was harder to read, cool and composed, as always. Melissa, apparently undeterred by the discomfort she'd created, leaned in closer, her voice dipping into a conspiratorial whisper. "So, how's life in Maggie's house treating you? Must feel strange, huh?" Brian shifted uncomfortably. "It's different," he replied, trying to steer the conversation away from his underwear. "Oh, I bet! That house has so much history!" Melissa cooed, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "I've lived next door long enough to see what it does to people. You know, changes them. People who stay there long enough, they start losing track of things, forgetting stuff, like they're being watched." She winked again, this time with a darker undertone. Janine, catching on to the eerie direction, chimed in. "What's next, Melissa? The house going to start cooking them dinner too?" Melissa's expression soured, ignoring the joke. "No, I'm serious. That house, it has a way of holding on to people. It's not just the creaky floors, it's like something's waiting." She paused dramatically, especially that painting in the attic. Brian stiffened. Melissa seemed to know how unsettling that painting had been, and it sent a shiver down his spine. The air around the table grew tense. Anne shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable now, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. "You know," Melissa added, flashing a sly grin, "if you ever need someone to, I don't know, keep you company when you're feeling a little too lonely in that big, creepy house, I'm always next door. And, well, I've already seen you in your underwear. So it wouldn't be too awkward, right?" Brian swallowed hard, feeling like he wanted to disappear under the table, while Alex tried to hide his laughter behind his beer. Before he could respond, the bar's lights flickered, once, twice, and then went out entirely. Conversations halted, and the room was plunged into darkness. In the silence, a slow, deliberate breath echoed through the room, heavy and too close for comfort. Brian squeezed Anne's hand under the table, his pulse quickening. The air around them felt thick and suffocating. "I told you." Melissa's voice drifted through the darkness, barely above a whisper. And just like that, every joke, every awkward comment died in their throats. What had started as an absurd conversation now felt far too real. The house was unsettlingly silent. Brian lay motionless in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, unable to escape the unsettling evening they'd just had. Beside him, Anne shifted under the covers, her body tense, but her eyes closed. He knew she was still awake. Just like him, her mind was likely buzzing with a million thoughts. Melissa's words at the bar stuck with him like a splinter. The air in the house felt heavier, oppressive, as if it was listening to their every breath. Brian reached for Anne's hand under the covers, and she gently squeezed it back. "Do you think Melissa's right?" Anne whispered, her voice barely audible in the darkness. Brian exhaled deeply. "No, she's just messing with us. You know how she is." But even as he said the words, doubt crept in. After what felt like an eternity, Anne's breathing evened out, signaling she had finally slipped into sleep. Brian, however, was still wide awake, replaying the strange events of the night in his head. But eventually, the weight of his exhaustion won, and he drifted off. The dream was different from the uneasy haze Brian had expected. The bedroom felt familiar, yet something about it wasn't quite right. The air was warmer, almost unnaturally so, and Anne lay beside him, her body soft and relaxed. For the first time in months, the tension between them had melted away. She turned to him, her smile slow and affectionate, but there was a faint undercurrent of unease that Brian couldn't place. Her hand moved gently down his chest, her touch sending a strange, flickering warmth through his skin. Brian's breath hitched as her fingers traveled lower, her body pressing closer to his, but something about the warmth didn't feel quite right. It was as if the dream was trying too hard to mimic reality, the light from the window spilling over her skin in a way that felt staged, almost too perfect. "Brian," she whispered, her lips brushing his neck. The sensation sent a shiver through him, but not the kind he'd anticipated. He kissed her, his hands tracing the familiar contours of her body, but the longer it went on, the more it felt wrong. The closeness was hollow, like something vital was missing. Her movements, once fluid and loving, started to feel off, robotic even. Still, he tried to push the unease aside, forcing himself to focus on the moment. "I love you," Anne breathed, her voice soft, but it lacked the warmth he was used to. Brian's hands gripped her hips, but instead of feeling comforted, his heart began to race. The air in the room felt heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on him. Then, without warning, Anne's body stiffened. The warmth of her touch vanished, replaced by a cold that spread through Brian's chest like ice. His eyes snapped open in confusion, and what he saw nearly made him stop breathing. It wasn't Anne anymore. His grandmother's face stared back at him. Brian recoiled, a gasp of horror escaping his throat. The figure that had been Anne a moment ago was now his grandmother, her eyes wide and unblinking, her face twisted into a chilling, emotionless mask. The warmth in the room drained away completely, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. "Grandma?" His voice trembled, barely audible, as he tried to comprehend what was happening. The tender moment had dissolved into something nightmarish. The walls seemed to close in, their edges warping in the darkening room. His grandmother didn't move at first. She stood over him, clutching the familiar silver candlesticks she had prized for years. The gleam from the metal reflected the dim light in the room, but now the candlesticks looked more like tools of judgment than decoration. "You never listened, Brian," she said, her voice sharp and cold, slicing through the air like a knife. "You never listened when I told you what that house meant." Brian took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. This is a dream," he stammered, trying to force himself to wake up. "It's not real." A small, cruel smile tugged at the corners of his grandmother's lips. "Oh, it's real, Brian. More real than you think." Her voice was eerily calm, the kind of calm that made his skin crawl. "And I've come to tell you something you've been too blind to see." The room seemed to shift around him, the air growing colder, the shadows deepening. The walls appeared to press inward, the space tightening like a trap. His grandmother took a step forward, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. Brian's breath hitched, his body frozen in place. She raised the candlesticks, her fingers tightening around them with a strength that seemed unnatural. "Your wife, she's pregnant." Brian blinked, his mind struggling to make sense of her words. "What? No, we've been trying, but—" "She's pregnant," his grandmother repeated, her tone colder, more absolute. "And it's a boy, your firstborn son." The news should have been a cause for joy, but the way his grandmother delivered it made Brian's blood run cold. His pulse thundered in his ears, his hands trembling. The smile that spread across her face was anything but comforting. "You should be happy," she said, stepping closer, her face expressionless except for the icy glint in her eyes. "But you won't be, not for long. That house has plans for him, Brian." Brian's stomach lurched, dread coiling in his chest. He took another step back, but there was nowhere to go. The room was suffocating, the walls twisting as if the house itself were closing in on him. "What do you mean?" His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "What plans?" His grandmother's smile widened, her teeth gleaming in the dim light. "You'll find out soon enough, but you need to be careful." Her voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "Don't let it take him." The shadows around her pulsed and writhed, the silver candlesticks in her hands glowing with an unnatural light. Brian raised his hands, shielding his eyes from the piercing glow, and just before everything went dark, her whispering voice echoed in his mind one last time. "Don't let it take him. 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 Him." Brian jolted awake, gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. The bedroom was silent, the shadows of night pressing in around him. But something was wrong. The air felt heavier, like the house was listening. Beside him, Anne slept peacefully, unaware of the terrifying message that had just been delivered. But Brian knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a dream. His grandmother had spoken to him, and whatever she had meant, it was already starting. The early morning light streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the bedroom. Brian sat at the edge of the bed, nervously bouncing his leg as he watched Anne pace back and forth in the bathroom. "Come on, it'll be fine," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just take the test." Anne shot him a look that was part nervousness, part disbelief. "Brian, we've done this before. What makes you think it'll be different this time?" Brian didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound ridiculous. He couldn't exactly say, "Well, Maggie told me, in a dream, last night?" That would make him sound completely insane. Instead, he simply smiled and said, "I've just got a feeling." With a sigh, Anne finally relented and disappeared into the bathroom. Brian's heart raced as the seconds ticked by. He could hear her moving around, the sound of the test being unwrapped, the water running. Brian held his breath. A minute later, Anne stepped out, holding the test in her hand, her face unreadable. Brian's stomach twisted. He stood up, crossing the room in 2 quick strides. "Well?" he asked, his voice shaky. She looked at the test, then back at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's positive." For a moment, Brian couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air, surreal and unbelievable. "Positive? You're pregnant?" Anne nodded, her hand resting gently on her stomach as if she still couldn't fully comprehend what was happening. "We're pregnant, Brian." Brian's face broke into a grin, and before either of them could say anything else, he swept her into his arms. They held each other tightly, the weight of years of waiting and hoping finally lifting from their shoulders. But in the back of his mind, a flicker of something darker lingered, Grandmama's ominous words from his dream. The next morning, Anne and Brian were out for a walk, enjoying the cool October breeze and trying to soak in the news. They had barely processed it themselves when, as if summoned by some nosy sixth sense, Melissa appeared from around the corner, practically bouncing toward them. "Well, well, well," Melissa drawled, her eyes already narrowing as she took in the sight of Anne's hand resting on her stomach. "What do we have here?" She stopped in front of them, one hand on her hip and the other gesturing toward Anne's belly. "Oh, don't tell me, you're pregnant, aren't you?" Anne looked at Brian, taken aback, and then back at Melissa. "How did you know?" Melissa grinned, her eyes sparkling with smug satisfaction. "Oh, honey, it's not that hard. You're glowing, and I saw you touching your stomach. I have a knack for these things, you know." She paused, and her expression darkened. "But you do know what they say, right?" Brian resisted the urge to groan. He knew exactly what was coming next. "You shouldn't be pregnant in that house," Melissa said in a hushed tone, glancing around as if someone might be eavesdropping on their private conversation. "Maggie's house has history. Bad things happen there, especially to pregnant women. I've heard stories." "Melissa," Brian started, trying to keep his patience, "we're not interested in your ghost stories. The house is fine." Melissa ignored him, her gaze locked on Anne. "You be careful, dear. That house isn't what it seems, and neither is that painting." Anne shifted uncomfortably, her hand instinctively covering her stomach again. "The painting? Oh, you know exactly which one I'm talking about." Melissa said ominously. "That man with the candlesticks. Just be sure you don't bring that baby anywhere near it. Houses like that, they remember things." Brian had had enough. "Thanks for the advice, Melissa, but we're fine, really." Melissa gave him a pointed look before walking off, her final words hanging in the air like a curse. "You'll see. Mark my words." 2 days later, Brian and Anne met up with Alex and Janine at a cafe to share the news. The air was crisp, the fall colors vibrant, and the mood was light and festive. Brian could barely contain his excitement. "So," Brian said, leaning forward across the table with a grin, "we've got some news." Alex raised an eyebrow, his grin already forming. "What? You finally figured out how to polish Grandmama's candlesticks properly?" Janine rolled her eyes and gave Alex a playful shove. "Let them talk, you goof." Anne smiled, squeezing Brian's hand. "Actually, we're pregnant." There was a brief silence, followed by an explosion of excitement. Janine practically jumped out of her chair. "Oh my God! That's amazing!" She grabbed Anne's hand, her eyes shining with joy. "How far along are you? Do you know if it's a boy or a girl?" Alex, always the joker, leaned back with a smirk. "Well, knowing Brian's luck, it'll probably be twins, twice the trouble. Or twice the candlesticks," Brian shot back with a grin. "But no, just one so far, and we don't know the gender yet." Janine beamed. "This is so wonderful. Finally some good news. You two deserve it." The rest of the lunch was filled with laughter, jokes, and stories about baby names, all of them ridiculous, of course. Alex suggested naming the baby after obscure cartoon characters, while Janine attempted to keep things serious by suggesting classic names. For the first time in a while, the weight of the house, the painting, and Melissa's warnings seemed to disappear. But when they returned home later that evening, all the warmth from the day evaporated in an instant. As they stepped into their bedroom, both Brian and Anne froze. Sitting on the dresser, perfectly centered in the middle of the room, was the painting. The man with the candlesticks. Neither of them had any idea how it had gotten there. It had been in the attic, sealed away in its dusty corner. They hadn't moved it. And yet, there it was, staring at them with its hollow, haunting eyes. Brian's heart raced, and he felt Anne's hand tighten around his. "Brian," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "How did it get here?" He couldn't answer. All he knew was that they hadn't touched the painting. No one had. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the painting was waiting. The bedroom was unnervingly still, the air thick with tension. The painting sat on the dresser, the man's hollow eyes following their every movement. Brian's hand tightened around Anne's as they both stared at it, neither of them speaking, neither of them daring to breathe too loudly. "I don't know," Brian replied, his heart pounding. "We didn't touch it. No one's been up in the attic since we put it there." The house creaked ominously, as if it were confirming his fears. He glanced at Anne, the flicker of fear in her eyes mirroring his own. "We need to put it back," she said, stepping forward, but Brian grabbed her arm gently, stopping her. "Wait, what if—" He paused, not sure how to say what he was thinking without sounding ridiculous. What if there's something we're not seeing? Something wrong with the house? Anne's breath caught in her throat just as Brian reached for the frame. A sudden knock echoed from the front door, startling both of them. "What now?" Anne whispered, her voice shaky. "I'll go check," Brian said, glancing back at the painting before reluctantly leaving the room. As he moved down the hallway, the house seemed to creak and groan, almost like it was listening to every step. When he opened the door, Melissa stood there, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. She wore a casual outfit, but her eyes seemed to linger on him a little too long, darting over his shoulder as if expecting someone, or something, else to appear. A faint smirk curled at her lips, the familiar spark of mischief in her eyes returning. Her nervous energy had shifted, replaced by something else, something more intentional. "You're here late," Brian said, his stomach tightening with suspicion. Melissa leaned against the doorframe, her eyes dragging down his chest as if appraising him. "Well, she purred, her voice dipping. "I thought I might catch you in your boxers again. Didn't get quite the show last time." Her smile widened, her gaze unabashedly traveling over his body. "You always manage to look good in the middle of the night. Must be all that running around this creepy old house keeping you in shape." Brian frowned, his patience wearing thin. "We're fine, Melissa. Is there something you needed?" She laughed lightly, ignoring his tone as she took a step closer. "Oh, I just saw the lights on and thought I'd check in. The place can do funny things at night, and I thought maybe you'd want some company, in case you got spooked." Her eyes gleamed with something playful, as if testing just how far she could push him. Brian's jaw tightened. "We're fine," he repeated more firmly this time, "but thanks for your concern." Melissa raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by his resistance. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I told you, Brian. You've been here long enough to know by now." Her gaze flicked back toward the house, her tone shifting, becoming more serious. "That painting." Brian's blood ran cold. He didn't like the way she said that, like she knew more than she was letting on. "What do you know, Melissa?" Her face sobered slightly, glancing around as though someone might overhear. "I've lived next door long enough to know Maggie kept things hidden in that house, things you shouldn't go looking for. That painting is part of it. It's watching you." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. Before Brian could respond, Anne appeared in the doorway, her presence cooling the air between them. Melissa's eyes immediately dropped to Anne's stomach, her expression softening, but there was still a glint of calculation in her gaze. "You really should be careful, Anne," Melissa said, her voice sweet but pointed. "You need to get out before it's too late." Anne opened her mouth to respond, her discomfort palpable, but before she could say anything, Melissa's eyes darted up, focusing on something behind them, something inside the house. "I've said enough," Melissa muttered, backing away, her flirty demeanor vanishing as quickly as it had arrived. "You'll figure it out. Sooner or later, you'll realize what's really going on." With that, she was gone, leaving Brian and Anne standing in the doorway. The chill from the night air slipped into the house, like an unwelcome guest creeping in. 2 days later, Brian and Anne met Alex and Janine for lunch. The weather was crisp, the sky a vibrant autumn blue, and despite the tension at home, Brian was looking forward to the distraction. They hadn't told Alex and Janine about the painting yet. He wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding paranoid. At the cafe, the four of them chatted lightly at first, the usual banter about work and daily life. But Brian couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over him since that night. Finally, he glanced at Anne, who gave him a small nod. "Something weird's been happening at the house," Brian said, leaning in slightly. "We found the painting in our bedroom. We didn't move it. It just appeared." Janine, who had been sipping her drink, froze slightly but recovered quickly, her face unreadable. Alex, however, laughed. "What, the spooky candlestick guy? Maybe he got tired of the attic." Brian didn't smile. "It's not funny, Alex. This is, I don't know. It feels like something's messing with us." Anne nodded, her face serious. "And Melissa, our neighbor, keeps warning us. She's convinced the house is dangerous. She says Maggie knew things that we don't." "Melissa always was a bit much," Janine said, her voice cool and detached. "But maybe she's not completely wrong." Brian raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Janine hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to Alex, then back to her drink. She swirled the liquid around in the glass, as if contemplating how much to say. "Houses like that, they have history. Sometimes things get left behind." Alex, sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood. "Come on, you don't seriously believe the house is haunted, do you?" But Janine wasn't laughing. She remained quiet, her gaze distant, her expression unreadable. Brian exchanged a look with Anne. There was something Janine wasn't telling them, something she had been hiding for a while. He didn't push it now, but the unease in his chest grew. Later that evening, Brian and Anne returned home, hoping the afternoon out had helped them shake the strange occurrences. But as soon as they walked through the front door, the heavy feeling returned, like the house was waiting for them. "Let's just go to bed," Anne said quietly, though neither of them felt remotely calm. As they entered the bedroom, they both stopped in their tracks. The painting, the man with the candlesticks, was back on the dresser, staring at them with the same cold, unblinking eyes. "How is it back?" Anne's voice was trembling now. Brian's blood ran cold. They had moved it again earlier that day, back into the attic, locking the door behind them. But here it was, waiting for them once more. The house had an unsettling stillness to it that evening. After the shock of finding the painting back in their bedroom, Brian and Anne moved it once again to the attic, making sure to lock the door behind them. But neither of them could shake the eerie feeling that the house was playing tricks on them. Worse, they couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that someone was behind it. That someone, Brian was beginning to believe, might be Melissa. Melissa's warnings had gone from mildly irritating to deeply unsettling. She was always around, popping up when they least expected it, her cryptic comments about the house becoming more pointed with each encounter. Brian had always found her nosy, but now it seemed like she was watching them, waiting for something. As the weeks passed, Melissa's presence loomed over them like a storm cloud. It wasn't just her sudden appearances, it was the way she seemed to know too much. Every time Anne left the house, Melissa would find an excuse to chat, dropping hints that made Anne's stomach twist. "How's the baby?" Melissa would ask, her eyes darting to Anne's growing belly with an unnerving intensity. "I hope the house isn't causing you any stress." She always said it with a knowing smile, as if she was in on a secret the couple couldn't quite grasp. Anne had brushed it off at first, but after the painting incident, Melissa's comments took on a darker tone. Brian could see the toll it was taking on her. She didn't sleep well anymore, and every creak of the house made her flinch. "Do you think she's doing something to us?" Anne asked one night as they lay in bed. The room was quiet, but the weight of the question hung in the air between them. "Maybe she's moving things around, trying to scare us." Brian sighed, staring up at the ceiling. "I don't know. I've thought about it. She's definitely weird. But why would she want to drive us out? It doesn't make sense." Anne frowned. "Maybe it's the baby. She's been obsessed with it ever since she found out, always talking about how dangerous the house is for pregnant women. It's like she's waiting for something to happen." Brian shifted, the unease twisting in his gut. "We've been careful. We've made sure the house is locked up." "Melissa doesn't have a key. She couldn't just come in and move things." Anne didn't respond. Instead, she lay quietly beside him, her hand resting on her stomach. Despite Brian's attempts to rationalize the situation, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Melissa was somehow involved. Over the next several months, things continued to escalate. The painting in the attic was just the beginning. Brian would come home from work to find lights turned on that he knew they had turned off. Anne would find doors slightly ajar that she was certain had been shut. On one particularly unsettling evening, they returned from a doctor's appointment to find the attic door wide open, the painting sitting at the top of the stairs, facing directly toward their bedroom. "This is getting out of control," Brian muttered, pulling the attic door shut with more force than necessary. "It's like she's doing this just to mess with us." "Melissa?" Anne asked, though her voice was thick with fatigue. "How would she even get in? We've locked everything." Brian didn't have an answer, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Melissa was behind it. It was like she knew when they weren't home, slipping in to rearrange things, just to push them closer to the edge. Melissa's presence became almost suffocating. She would appear on their doorstep unexpectedly, a too friendly smile plastered on her face, her eyes lingering just a little too long on Anne's growing belly. Every time they bumped into her, she would drop subtle hints about the house. "You've got to be careful, especially in the last few months," Melissa said one morning, catching them outside as Anne was heading to her car. "Strange things tend to happen as the baby grows. You might want to think about staying somewhere else." Brian clenched his jaw. "We're not leaving." Melissa tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "I'm just looking out for you. You know, I've seen what happens when people ignore the signs. That house doesn't take kindly to new life." Anne's hand instinctively moved to her stomach. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing," Melissa replied lightly, as if she hadn't just said something horrifying. "Just a feeling. You'll see." As Anne's pregnancy progressed, the house underwent a transformation, and not just from the eerie disturbances. They had spent months renovating, preparing the nursery, repainting walls, and fixing up the place in anticipation of the baby. Every room had been touched, scrubbed, and polished, but despite their best efforts to make the house feel like their own, the unease never quite left. One of Brian's personal projects had been the attic, where he found that unsettling portrait, the man with the silver candlesticks. From the moment he first laid eyes on it, he wanted nothing more than to get rid of it. He'd even made up his mind one afternoon to toss it in the dumpster. But as he carried the frame out of the attic, a strange heaviness settled in his chest. It wasn't just emotional. Something physical weighed him down. His hands froze, his heart raced, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he just couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It felt wrong. Reluctantly, Brian returned the painting to the attic, shoving it back into the shadows. But it didn't stay there. No matter how many times he banished it, the painting would reappear. Sometimes in the hallway, other times in their bedroom. Always watching, always waiting, and with every reappearance, the disturbances in the house grew worse. Objects would move on their own, cabinets would swing open, and sometimes, in the dead of night, they could hear faint whispers, just at the edge of hearing, like someone was having a conversation in another room. Brian's rational mind told him it had to be Melissa. Maybe she had a key or found some twisted way to sneak in. Maybe this was her sick way of driving them out of the house. But as the weeks wore on, the strange occurrences defied any logical explanation. The electronics in the house started malfunctioning, lights flickering, radios turning on by themselves. One night, the TV in the living room switched on with a loud, static hum at exactly 3 a.m., even though Brian had unplugged it before bed. And still, lurking at the edges of their thoughts, was the painting. No matter what Brian did, it always found its way back, like a stubborn ghost, refusing to be forgotten. As Anne's pregnancy neared its final days, the house grew more suffocating. The air felt heavy, almost tangible, and Brian couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut that they weren't alone. He and Anne avoided talking about it, but they both knew something was wrong. One evening, after another incident where they found the painting inexplicably sitting at the foot of their bed, they decided they couldn't take it anymore. Melissa had been circling them like a hawk for months, offering cryptic warnings and unsolicited advice, and Brian was convinced she was behind all of it. It was time to confront her directly. They found Melissa in her garden the next morning as usual. She greeted them with that same unsettling smile, her eyes flicking to Anne's stomach before settling on Brian. "Morning," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You two look tense." "We need to talk," Brian said, his voice hard. "About the house, about what you know." Melissa's smile didn't falter, but her eyes darkened slightly. "I've been warning you since the day you moved in. What more is there to talk about?" "You've been more than warning us," Brian snapped. "You've been in the house, haven't you? Moving things, playing tricks, trying to drive us out." Melissa raised an eyebrow, her expression one of amused disbelief. "You think I've been sneaking into your house, Brian? Really? You give me far too much credit." Anne stepped forward, her hand protectively over her stomach. "If it's not you, then who? Or what?" Melissa's gaze softened, but there was still something calculating behind her eyes. "I told you. The house doesn't like being disturbed, and your baby, well, it's drawn to new life. It wants what's coming." Brian felt a chill creep down his spine. What does that even mean? Melissa glanced toward the house, her voice lowering as though afraid someone, or something, might overhear. "That house has a history, Brian." Maggie knew it. She understood the way it works. But she never told you, did she? Anne's brow furrowed. Told us what? The house takes, Melissa said simply. It has for generations. And now that there's a new life growing inside that house, it's waking up. It's been preparing for this. The weight of her words hung in the air, the morning chill suddenly more biting. Brian's heart raced, his mind scrambling to reject the idea. What are you talking about? It's a house, Melissa. A house can't take. She smirked, but there was no humor in her eyes. You're wrong. This one can. Haven't you noticed? The way things disappear, the way it holds on to people, Maggie knew. That's why she never left, even when everyone else did. Anne, pale and visibly shaken, gripped Brian's arm. This is ridiculous. You're talking about the house like it's alive. Brian shook his head, the disbelief and frustration bubbling to the surface. You're just trying to mess with us. Melissa's smile twisted into something darker. Mess with you? You think I want to play games? I've lived next to this house for years and I've seen things, Brian. People come, they change, and then they're gone. Maggie never talked about it, but she knew. She accepted it. Anne's voice cracked as she spoke, her fear clear. Accepted what? The house chooses, Melissa replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It's always chosen. And now, with your baby, it's made its choice. Brian stood frozen, a cold sweat creeping down his back. He couldn't believe it, didn't want to believe it. But something about the house, something he couldn't explain, was gnawing at him. A few weeks later, Anne went into labor. The birth was long, but eventually their son was born, small, perfect, and oblivious to the dark cloud that hung over his arrival. The couple returned home, exhausted but relieved, hoping the strange disturbances would finally stop now that the baby had arrived. But they didn't. If anything, the house seemed more alive than ever. The painting had found its way back to the foot of their bed, and strange noises echoed through the halls at night. Soft footsteps, whispers that seemed just out of reach. Nothing had happened until Alex and Janine arrived a few days after the birth to meet the baby. Still, Brian couldn't shake the strange tension in the air. Janine had been distant, distracted, ever since they'd told her about the birth. She lingered by the windows, her gaze often drifting toward the house as if she were waiting for something to happen. As Anne sat with Alex, showing him how to hold the baby, Brian caught Janine staring blankly toward the attic door. Her face was tight, her expression unreadable, but there was something dark in her eyes. You're staring, Brian said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. As Anne sat with Alex, showing him how to hold the baby, Brian caught Janine staring blankly toward the attic door. Her face was tight, her expression unreadable, but there was something dark in her eyes. You're staring, Brian said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She ascended, not speaking, her fingertips brushing the banister as though she'd walked this path before. Once inside the attic, Janine's eyes immediately locked onto the dusty corner where they had stashed the portrait of the man holding the candlesticks. Without a word, she walked over to it, knelt, and pulled the painting from its resting place. She brought it down to the nursery, her touch lingering on the canvas. I know this man, she whispered, her voice shaking as her fingers traced the edges of the frame. Brian frowned, his unease growing. What do you mean? He's just some old portrait Maggie kept in the attic. Janine's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a crack in her usual indifference. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. He's not just some man. He was my husband. The words hit Brian like a punch to the gut. What are you talking about? Taking a deep breath, Janine's hands trembled as they touched the candlesticks in the painting. I've lived many lives, Brian, more than you can imagine, and so has he. Brian took a step back, his heart pounding. Janine, what are you saying? She turned to face him fully now, her eyes haunted with memories that spanned lifetimes. I talked to Maggie about this years ago. This man, the one in the painting, he was my husband, many, many years ago, in another life. We lived in this house, and he murdered me. Brian's mind reeled. That's impossible. Janine shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. It's not impossible. It's the curse of this house. We've been bound to it for centuries. Every time I come back, I remember more of what happened. And this time I know he's still here. He's always been here. Brian felt a chill settle deep in his bones. You think he's the one doing all this? Moving the painting, making the house wake up? Janine nodded, her voice barely a whisper now. Yes, he's waiting for something that was taken from him when he killed me. Brian's stomach twisted. The baby. Yes, Janine said, her face pale as the truth settled between them. He wants the baby. He's been waiting all this time, waiting for another chance. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Melissa's cryptic warnings, the strange disturbances, the way the house seemed to pulse with life as Anne's pregnancy progressed. It wasn't just the house. It was the man in the painting. And Janine's secret, her connection to the house, to him, was the key to it all. The house seemed to breathe with them, its oppressive silence wrapping around Brian, Anne, Janine, and Alex as they stood in the flickering candlelight. The painting of the man with the candlesticks and the silver tray at his feet, with an eerily perfect turkey, loomed larger than ever, its eyes glinting with malice. Every breath felt like a countdown to something dreadful, something inevitable. Janine's voice broke through the tension, calm yet filled with urgency. We don't have much time. He's waking up. He'll come through soon. Anne stood close to Brian, one hand protectively resting on her stomach, while Alex paced the room, his face pale but determined. Are we really doing this? He muttered, glancing uneasily at the painting. We have to, Brian said, locking eyes with his brother. There's no turning back now. Janine positioned herself near the painting, her fingers trembling slightly. We're going to bring him out and solve this madness once and for all. Once it's here, we can end this, but I'll need your energy, Anne. You're connected to the house now, through the baby. He'll be drawn to you. Alex glanced between Brian and Janine, confused and on edge. And what am I supposed to do? Just stand here while my wife summons a murderous ghost? Janine shot him a glance, her tone unusually soft. No, Alex, I'll need you to help hold the energy. Just stay close. I can't do this without you. Though hesitant, Alex stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder as she lit candles in a circle around the painting. The air felt charged, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for whatever was about to unfold. Brian's heart pounded as Janine began her chant. The room darkened as if the walls were closing in, and the flames of the candles grew unnaturally tall, casting long, twisted shadows that danced of their own accord. Anne stood at the center of the room, next to her newborn, her body tense with anticipation. Her eyes flicked to Brian, and despite the fear and uncertainty that hung over them, there was still a flicker of intimacy between them. She reached for him, their bodies pressing together in a rare, quiet moment of closeness. I love you, she whispered, her breath warm against his ear, her hands sliding down his chest. It wasn't the right moment, but maybe that was the point. It felt like they were on the brink of something, and all they had was each other. I love you too, Brian whispered back, his fingers tracing her spine, grounding himself in her touch. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. Darkness swallowed them, and a low, guttural laugh reverberated around the space, deep, menacing, and far too close. The figure in the painting rippled as the man began to step out of the canvas. He was tall, impossibly tall, his features sharp and eerily beautiful. The silver candlesticks in his hands gleamed in the dim light, but his eyes were locked on Anne. Beneath him, the turkey tray glistened, as if symbolizing the ritual and feasts of past lives. Alex instinctively stepped in front of Janine, his expression one of shock and disbelief. What the hell is happening? He gasped. He's here, Janine whispered, her voice almost lost in the chaos. The man's smile curled wickedly as he moved toward Anne. You've been waiting for me, haven't you? His voice dripped with malice, laced with a twisted kind of affection. Brian instinctively jumped in front of Anne, blocking the spirit's path. "Stay away from her!" But the man ignored Brian, his gaze still fixed on Anne. His hand reached out, caressing her cheek with a sickening familiarity. Anne recoiled, her breath hitching in her throat. "I've waited lifetimes for this," the spirit whispered. "You and I, bound by fate." The turkey tray shimmered in the dim light, a chilling reminder of the man's obsession with control, consumption, and the twisted family gatherings of the past. Anne's body hid the tiny baby, her protective instincts overriding her fear. "You can't have him!" she spat, her voice firm. The spirit smiled, stepping closer. "Oh, but I will! I always do!" Brian lunged at the man, his rage overwhelming him, but the spirit swatted him away like an afterthought. Brian slammed into the wall, gasping for breath. "Brian!" Anne cried, rushing to his side. Alex, his face set with grim determination, grabbed a candlestick from a nearby dresser and swung it at the spirit. It hit him square in the chest, causing the man to stagger. "You'll regret that!" the spirit growled, his voice laced with anger. As the man advanced toward Alex, Janine's chanting grew louder, more urgent. The shadows around the room seemed to come alive, coiling around the spirit like tendrils, pulling him back toward the painting. "No!" the spirit roared, his form flickering as the shadows tightened their grip. Anne knelt beside Brian, helping him to his feet as they watched Janine's spell take hold. The spirit's face twisted in rage, but his eyes never left Anne's belly. "This isn't over," he hissed. "I will return. I always return." Fueled by adrenaline, Brian grabbed the second candlestick and drove it into the spirit's chest. The man let out a blood-curdling scream as his body dissolved, sucked back into the painting. The force of it sent Janine to the floor, her body trembling with the strain of maintaining the spell. The spirit's voice echoed one last time as he disappeared into the canvas. "I will return. I will return. Ah!" It let out a final, bone-chilling scream as it was sucked back into the painting. Janine collapsed to the floor, exhausted but triumphant. The house fell silent, the air heavy with the aftermath of the battle. Brian wrapped his arms around Anne, his heart racing. "It's over," he whispered, though part of him still wasn't sure. Suddenly, there was a knock at the front door. Brian tensed, exchanging a worried glance with Anne. He wasn't sure if he could handle another surprise. When he opened the door, there stood Melissa, holding a tray of cookies, her usual smug smile plastered across her face. "Well, look at you all! Alive and well!" she chirped, her voice grating against the tense air. "I just came by to check on you. You know, make sure the house hadn't swallowed you up." Brian blinked in disbelief. After everything they'd been through, Melissa was still playing her part as the nosy neighbor, completely oblivious to the horror they had just survived. "You really have no idea what's going on, do you?" Brian asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Melissa raised an eyebrow, glancing past him into the house. "What are you talking about? I told you this house has a mind of its own. I've seen it happen before, but you're all fine, so I guess nothing's wrong after all." Anne let out a weak laugh, her tension finally breaking. "Melissa, you're a piece of work." Melissa gave them a confused look. "Well, if you say so," she muttered, turning to leave. "Just thought I'd check in. But hey, if you ever need anything, I'm right next door." As she walked away, Brian couldn't help but shake his head, his body sagging with relief. "She really didn't have anything to do with it," he mumbled, finally understanding. The drive away from the house was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The baby slept peacefully in Anne's arms, unaware of the danger that had nearly claimed his life. Brian glanced at Anne, her face serene but tired. "We're safe now," he said, more to reassure himself than anything. Anne smiled weakly, leaning against him. "We are." Alex, sitting in the back seat with Janine, finally broke the silence. "So, what now?" Janine's eyes were distant as she stared out the window. "Now, we live, we move forward. The house is behind us." But even as she said the words, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of the man in the painting. The house might be behind them, but its shadow lingered. As they drove further into the night, Brian tightened his grip on Anne's hand. Whatever came next, they would face it together. For now, at least, they had won. For now. Wow, what a story. From strange paintings to ominous warnings, this haunted house is definitely hiding more than just dust. I hope you enjoyed the chills and suspense as much as I did. If you want more spooky tales like this, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're the first to catch the next one. And hey, what would you do if a painting seemed to follow you around? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, stay happy until the next story.